So good to see all of you this morning. If you'd like to open to Psalm 4, we're going to be in Psalm 4 this morning. Asking the question, you are so on top of things. Thank you, sir. Asking the question, I'm making that a routine, aren't I? I've got to do better than that. Did the sun set on your wrath? You know, that's, when I hear people talk about this most, what I hear people talk about is usually an argument with your spouse is usually how people talk about this. And you know, it's you go to bed and you're just kind of fuming about something, probably something insignificant if we're being honest, right? You know, it's, you know, someone didn't do the dishes or somebody forgot to finish a chore or pick up groceries or whatever it is, and they, you know, maybe it led to some kind of argument and you said some things that weren't really the nicest things you could have said. And so you're laying in bed and you're just angry and you're tossing and turning and rolling and fuming, and you know, that's when you think of all the things you wish you could have said, right? All those little biting things, you know, that, oh man, I wish I thought of that in the moment. And then people say, and you know, I've had this thought myself, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Isn't that what it says in Ephesians chapter 4? Ephesians chapter 4 and verses 26 and 27. Paul says in Ephesians 4 and 26, he says, be angry. It's fine to be angry, but do not sin. And then he says, do not let the sun go down on your wrath. And he follows that in verse 27 with, lest you give opportunity to the devil. Right? It's the idea of that opportunity, that there's something about anger that sort of sets us up to let the devil influence us, to kind of put his hooks in us and take us in a direction that if we weren't angry, we wouldn't have gone down that. And really all you have to do is go back to Cain to see an example of this. A man who got really angry and he let his anger control him. He gave the devil, or he gave sin, the opportunity to have too much or any influence over his life. And so that's when, you know, you wake your wife or you wake your husband up and you're like, I'm not supposed to let the sun go down on my wrath, and so we're going to deal with this right now. And you know, sometimes doesn't that turn into a worse fight than if you just slept it off that night and dealt with it the next morning? And that's how people talk to me about dealing with that. But in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26, he is actually quoting from Psalm 4. And so Psalm 4, you know, you think, well, he says, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. But that's really sort of his paraphrase of what Psalm 4 is about. And you ask, well, how do I do that then, Paul? He really intends for us to go back to Psalm 4 and to consider what David says we do with anger. Psalm 4 is a psalm about anger and about the proper response that we have to anger. Now, when you're thinking about David, before he wrote Psalm 4, David dealt with anger in 3 different ways. You can look back at his life and see, really, he had 3 different ways he dealt with anger before he wrote Psalm 4. And it really kind of all depended on who he was mad at that day. There was his anger that he had toward King Saul. And you read some of the Psalms and it will tell you this is about a time that he was hiding in a cave or something like that. He clearly was very angry with King Saul, and understandably so. We could sympathize with that. There's nothing wrong with that. But when it came to the Lord's anointed, as he called him, when it came to Saul, David was willing to put his anger aside and really think about what's best here, you know. That's how he dealt with that. But that's not how he dealt with anger with other people. And so you have, for example, do you remember when he was angry at Nabal? That's Abigail's husband. Everyone knows Abigail, right? Abigail's husband, Nabal, David had kind of gone alongside his shepherds and his sheep for a while and taken care of them and helped Nabal's guys out. But then when David needed help and he tried to turn to Nabal, Nabal says, I don't even know who David is. I'm not going to help this guy. And that's the way that David says it. This is in 2 Samuel 13, if you want to turn back there for a moment. 2 Samuel 13. And I'm sorry, it's not in 2 Samuel 13. Look at me, I'm telling you to go to the wrong place. Let's see here. It's 1 Samuel 25. Pardon me. 1 Samuel 25. In 1 Samuel chapter 25 and verse 12, after Nabal says, you know, I don't know this guy. It's 1 Samuel 25 and verse 12. it says, so David's young men turned on their heels and went back, and they came and they told him all these words. And so verse 13, this is David's response. He says, every man gird on his sword, right? We're going to go kill us some dumb people over there, you know. We're going to go to... He was very quick to want to take vengeance on Nabal. He's not the Lord's anointed, so, you know, we'll just take care of this ourselves. And so, quick to vengeance. That's the second way David dealt with anger. And then the third way had to do with his family members. When David was angry at his family members, he typically had a 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 6 mindset. 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 6, when his son Adonijah decided to lead a sort of rebellion against him and try to take the throne, it says David did not ever tell him, why are you doing these things? He never rebuked him. He never said anything. We're told back in First Samuel, I'm sorry, the Samuels are just throwing me for a loop today. 2 Samuel, this is where 2 Samuel 13 comes in, okay? 2 Samuel 13, we're told that when one of his sons did terrible things to a brother's sister, that David was very angry about it, but he doesn't do anything about it. And then we're told that another son, Absalom, asked to take that brother out and to go have a great picnic together. And David says, it says, why would you do that? Why would you take your brother? He kind of questions it. He kind of knows. Aren't you mad at your brother? Is this really the best way to handle, should you go by yourself somewhere with your brother when you're mad at him? But then when he pushes, he's like, all right, fine. Y'all go together. And of course, he murders his brother. David knew that but he doesn't do anything about it. And then after Absalom murders his brother, for more than 5 years, David doesn't see him. He won't be in his presence. He won't talk to him about it. They won't deal with it. So when it's the Lord's anointed, David's very careful about how he deals with his anger. When it's just some random Israelite Joe, David's quick to vengeance. But when it's his family, he's willing to push his anger down and ignore it, to do nothing with it. And so that leads us then to Psalm 4. Psalm 4 was written after Absalom begins to rebel against David and to try to take the throne. And in fact, really, you could say the fact that David never dealt with his anger, when he finally forgave Absalom, almost or more than 5 years later, the very next chapter says that Absalom began to work on convincing the people to follow him and not David. The fact that David didn't deal with his anger is what led to David fleeing Jerusalem, fleeing his throne, fleeing his home, as his son tried to take his power. And so as he is leaving in 1 Samuel 15, we come to Psalm 4 and how David has a new mindset about anger, how he's going to deal with it differently from now on. Notice Psalm 4, he says, hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have relieved me in my distress. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer. As he is fleeing from Jerusalem, the text told he didn't even get his shoes. He's barefoot, climbing up a mountain, running away from his own son. He says, hear me when I call. And there's sort of this idea that God, he remembers. God has answered his prayers before. God has taken care of him before. You have, he says, relieved me in my distress. I can remember times when I was distressed, when I was angry, when I was upset, when I was hurt, but you have relieved it. You have taken care of it. And so he says, have mercy on me. Look to me with kindness and grace and hear my prayer. He trusts God is going to take care of him again. Because God is always faithful, he could count on God to continue being faithful. Now from there it says in verse 2, how long, O you sons of men, will you turn my glory to shame? How long will you love worthlessness and seek falsehood? But know that the Lord has set apart for himself him who is godly. The Lord will hear when I call to him. This is where Paul quotes from in verse 4, be angry and do not sin. Meditate within your own heart on your bed and be still. Offer the sacrifice of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, who will show us any good? Lord, lift up the light of your countenance upon us. You have put gladness in my heart, more than in the season that their grain and wine increased. I will both lie down in peace and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. And that last verse especially is where Paul gets the idea of to not let the sun go down on your wrath, that he's going to bed and he's dealt with his anger, and that's why he can sleep so well at night. This like a baby, they say. And so what you have here really is David sort of dealing with his situation and sort of recognizing that he has got to deal with these things differently than he used to if he's going to have better results in the future. And so the first thing I think that he instructs us on is to put our anger in perspective. That when we get angry, sometimes what we tend to do is sort of, you kind of have one of those knee-jerk reactions. You just kind of jump to whatever seems best, and that's the struggle with anger. Some people like being angry because anger gives people a sense of confidence that they don't have when they're not angry. Have you ever felt that? When you're angry, you know what to do, right? You know how to handle something. You know what someone else needs. You always know what someone else needs, don't you? They need this. And then when you cool off, you realize none of those things are true or right. But sometimes people feel most confident when they're surging with rage. And so he says we need to stop and put our anger in perspective. He starts in verse 2 and 3 with a contrast. He says, how long, O you sons of men? Sons of men there, it's the idea kind of like in Genesis 6, of those who have chosen not to follow God. Those who, at least in this moment, have chosen the path that God would not choose for them. And he says, how long will you turn my glory to shame? How long will you treat the good things that I do as negative things? How long, he says, will you love worthlessness and seek falsehood? How long will you tell lies about me? How long will you accuse me of things that aren't true? How long are you going to persist in this path? But he contrasts that in verse 3 with, but no, if you keep going down this road, the Lord has set apart for himself him who is godly. The word godly there is literally the idea to sort of bow the neck in agreement or in cooperation. Today, what we would call it's the head nod, right? You ever give someone the head nod when you kind of someone you know or that you trust or that you just, that kind of that look across the room and you're agreeing about something? It's the head nod, or the younger generation does the up nod, right? And so it's that we're together on this. We agree on this. There's a connection there, sort of a glance of the eye and a nod of the head. We agree. He says the Lord has set apart for himself him who agrees with him, him who cooperates him who has chosen to go down the road that God has chosen, him who agrees to follow God wherever God would go, to handle things the way God would handle things. That's who God sets apart. That's who God preserves. He says, the Lord were here when I call to him. That's how he started, right? At the beginning of verse 1, he says, hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. To be the God of my righteousness is really to say, you're the God who knows that I'm innocent here, that I haven't done what they've accused me of, that you are the God who knows who is right and who is wrong. And so if you know who is right and who is wrong, then you will hear when I call to you, because you will know that I have chosen to agree with you. And so really there's this contrast. Who is it that's going to have victory in the end? Who is it that's going to conquer, to win, to have victory? It's the one who agrees with God. It's the one who's godly, not the one who loves worthless things, who loves falsehoods, who accuses others of things that are wrong. And so if a godly person will have the victory, then he follows that in verses 4 and 5 with a godly perspective on anger. When we are angry, now, sometimes we're angry and we have legitimate reason to be angry, right? And that's, someone really did do something. Sometimes we're angry and afterwards we realize that we really didn't have a reason to be angry and we just kind of let ourselves, have you ever done that? Am I the only one? That you realize that my perspective was wrong. I didn't really have a reason to be angry. But when you're angry, it doesn't really matter, does it? It doesn't matter if it's a legitimate reason or not a legitimate reason. The feeling is real. That's what matters. And so the same thing applies whether someone has actually hurt you or they haven't hurt you. Either way, he says, if we're going to have a godly victory, then we get to have this godly perspective while we wait for that. Verse 4, be angry. There is nothing wrong with being angry. Anger is an emotion. Right? How many of you can control your emotions at will? Don't raise your hand because you're wrong. You can't control your emotions at will, right? You can't. When you feel angry, that's really God's given way of He built it into our systems to warn us something is wrong. When you feel angry, it's an alarm bell going off in your head saying, I am not safe in some way. I am not secure in some way. Something is wrong, and I need to take action to do something about it. Now again, sometimes we find out later that our perception was wrong, and there really was nothing to be angry about. But in that moment, it's just this warning system. I believe something is wrong. That's useful. That's a useful thing to have, unless, he says, be angry and do not sin. Unless we let that anger control us. And when you let anger take the lead, when you let the emotion dictate how you respond to things, you become Cain. You become the guy who looks up and realizes, I just killed my brother. Now, maybe it's not quite that extreme, but generally speaking, that's where this road leads to. That's how we end up treating people. That's when sin enters into the picture. And so he says, acknowledge that you're angry. Recognize that you're angry. Be honest with yourself. I am angry, and that's fine. But what I do next counts. And that's what he tells us to do with the rest of verse 4. He says there's nothing wrong with being angry unless it causes you to sin, unless it controls you. But with the rest of verse 4, he tells us what we should do so that we don't let our anger control us. And to be quite frank with you, it's not what I thought he was going to say. To be quite frank with you, what I've heard most people talk about when they quote Ephesians 4:26 and 27 is, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. That means go deal with the problem. Go talk to the person. Go have the conflict out and come to resolution before you go to bed that night. But that's not actually what he says, is it? Notice he doesn't say go talk to them. He says meditate within your heart on your bed and be still. Really, the idea is when you feel angry, before the anger takes control and causes you to do something you regret, go to a private place where you can talk with yourself. That's the meditate on your bed, right? That's the idea of meditate. Literally, it's to talk it over, right? To kind of have it out. Go somewhere where you can lay down, or if you're like me and you fall asleep easy, you can sit up. Whatever you need to do, Go somewhere where you can turn off the lights and things can be quiet, and you can sit and you can just talk with yourself for a little while about what you're angry about this emotion, about the problem that you're facing, about how someone has hurt you or whatever it is that you're angry about. Go somewhere where you can just quietly contemplate what is happening here so that you can get godly perspective and therefore have that godly victory that verse 3 describes. Go over and talk it over with yourself first. The idea of the heart, he says, the heart is that seat of decision making. The idea of before you make a decision about what to do with your anger, right? I know what that person needs. He needs a swift kick in the pant. Before you make a decision about what you're going to do, go to a quiet place where you're not talking to that person especially, and just talk it over with yourself. And then as you do that, he says at the end of verse 4, he says, and be still. Literally, what that means is keep your mouth shut. It's what they would have said a long time ago, to be dumb, right? Not dumb as in dummy, but dumb as in mute. That is, don't talk to another human about this. Not yet. You're not ready to talk to somebody else. You're not ready if you start venting to someone, it's going to get out of hand. Sometimes with our daughters, they'll be upset about something and they'll just start talking, and it's like fast talking, and they start saying, and they get more and more upset, and I'll just say, stop. We're not going to talk about this anymore for right now. You need to go sit on your bed and be quiet just for a little bit, and when you feel calm, we can talk about it. But they've gotten to where they're just so upset that everything they say gets more and more dramatic. Sometimes I have to do that for myself. Everything I say gets more and more dramatic. Stop. we're not going to talk about this right now. I'm going to talk it over with myself first. After I've talked it over with myself, then he says in verse 5 that I can offer the sacrifices of righteousness. And I think in essence what this is talking about is initially, you're going to talk it over with God. You're going to go pray about this some. What is the sacrifices of righteousness? I think the easiest way to understand it is to look at Psalm 51. Psalm 51 describes the sacrifices of righteousness, I think, in a pretty clear picture. You think sacrifices, especially if you're thinking the Psalms, sacrifices makes you think of, when they would sacrifice animals and things like that. And that is to a degree what he's talking about. He says in Psalm 51, and starting in verse 16, now Psalm 51 is David's psalm of repentance, where he is praying after he has had Uriah murdered, after his sin with Bathsheba. He is repenting of that. And so there's kind of, while anger is not a sin, there's kind of a similar thought process there about how to handle these things. And so he says in Psalm 51 in verse 16, he says, "For you do not desire sacrifice, God, or else I would give it. You do not delight in burnt offering." Right? So he's talking about the literal animal sacrifices, and he says, that's not what God really wants. Now, he asked for it, but notice what he really wants in verse 17. He says, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. These, O God, you will not despise. In other words, if you just go and you make the sacrifice for your sins, but it doesn't mean anything to you, you might as well have not done it, because it doesn't mean anything to God. There has to be a sincerity and honesty that you've really considered your sin so that you're broken by it. Then you go and offer the literal sacrifices. Then that does something for you. And that's why he continues in verse 18. He says, "Do good in your good pleasure to Zion. Build the walls of Jerusalem, and then you shall be pleased with," and here's that phrase, "the sacrifices of righteousness, with burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then they shall offer bulls on your altar." When they've got their hearts right, when they're broken by their sins, God can build the walls of Jerusalem. He can do good things with them, because then they'll come and they'll offer real sacrifices. Now, of course, back in Psalm 4, David is not talking about sin. He says anger is not sin. He says be angry and don't sin. But the principle still applies. While we're not dealing with sacrifices for sins, the idea is when you are angry, you've got to go to this quiet place so that you can really come to an honest and a sincere sort of understanding of what's going on, so that you can approach God and pray about it honestly and sincerely. So that you can approach God to figure out what to do. So that you can approach God to see, should I confront that person, or should I just let this go? Do I need to go and make things right with that person, or is this all just in my head? How am I going to move forward with this? Go to your room. Break yourself down. Maybe it's not going to be brokenness because you haven't sinned, but you're going to come to a more clear understanding of what you're really upset about. That's what they say. Anger is always just the most surface level emotion, and that underneath every time that you get angry, there's actually some other emotion. Maybe it's sadness or grief. Maybe it's loneliness. Maybe it's hurt or rejection. There's something else going on there. And if you can take your anger and push it aside, you can see what you're really upset about. Maybe you're really upset because they did hurt you. Or maybe you're really upset because of something that happened 20 years ago that somebody else did to you that has nothing to do with them. And you're just dealing with something that you haven't dealt with yet. And you're going to take it out on them because you're angry. Because something that they did reminded you of that person, or they look like that person, or whatever it is. Go to your room. Figure out, what am I really angry about? Let that anger dissipate. And now you can sincerely and honestly come before God, and you can pray about that situation. You can offer, as he says, the sacrifices of righteousness. And then he says in verse 5, and put your trust in the Lord. I think what's really key here is, let's say that you really have been hurt. Let's say that someone really has sinned against you. Put your trust in the Lord. Don't let your anger lead you to take vengeance. You know what Paul says in Romans 12 about vengeance? He says, Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. You know why vengeance belongs to God? Because with God, vengeance is just justice. When God takes vengeance, it's not even really like what we think of as vengeance. It's just justice. He always does just enough. He does what's right. He knows what discipline to do to get someone back on the right track. He knows what's best. Do you know what I do when I take vengeance? I do just enough and at least a little more. We almost can't help ourselves. If we're angry and we take vengeance, we hurt them as much as they hurt us and a little bit more, or maybe a lot more. We don't have the self-control. We don't have the big picture mindset. We don't have what God says. And so vengeance belongs to God because I will butcher vengeance every single time. It is not my place to take vengeance because it belongs to the judge. It belongs to God. Put your trust in the Lord. If there is vengeance to be taken, he will take vengeance. If there is right to be wronged, he will make that happen in his timing and in the way that is best for everybody. And when I can accept that and let go of that anger as I talk to him, then if I need to go confront someone because they have hurt me, I can go calmly and peacefully, considering what is best for everybody, what is best for the kingdom, what's the best way to deal with this, without anger, without vengeance, and without leading myself into sin and becoming a sort of Hatfield and McCoy situation, right? You know, if I can put all of these things into place, then I'm ready to deal with whatever it is that I need to do. Or maybe I'll realize I don't need to approach them at all. Like we said, maybe I'll realize it was all in my head and there's really nothing to talk about here. But I won't know that if I haven't given this process its due chance. He will take care of you. Trust in his timing and goodness. Now, notice then, if you'll turn back to 2 Samuel, and chapter 15. 2 Samuel 15. Notice, as David has fled from Jerusalem, from his son Absalom, and as he has dealt with the people he comes across, he deals with it differently than you've ever seen David deal with people before. And especially, I want you to notice the way that he deals, and I'm sorry, I just cannot get these verses right at all. It's 2 Samuel 16 that we're looking for. 2 Samuel 16, and starting in verse 5, he comes across a man named Shammai. And Shammai is a relative of King Saul's, and so he's very pleased to see David overthrown. And so he starts throwing rocks at David, and he starts mocking David and making fun at David and his servants. He's abusing them. And one of his men, Zariah, says, let me just go get rid of this guy, right? I have a big sword here, and I'm good at using it. And David says, no. Notice what he says in verse 12. 2 Samuel 16 and verse 12. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day. See, David has this new mindset of Psalm 4, and so he's able to sort of internally go into his bedroom, as it were, and kind of contemplate this within himself, to pray to God, and in that moment he realizes, I could take vengeance on this guy, and that would feel real good right now, but the right thing to do is to let God deal with it. Let God deal with it. And this is, as you watch him leave Jerusalem and then come back to Jerusalem, and all these people come to apologize to him, David deals with the apologies that day. He doesn't postpone anything. He doesn't let his anger boil and sit for a long time, and he doesn't cut anybody's head off, even though he's king and he had the right to do it. He deals with all of those things that day with forgiveness, with mercy, trusting in God. He has this new mindset that really is a picture of what Psalm 4 is talking about. And that's why he continues then in verses 6 through 8 of Psalm 4. And he says that once we have our anger in perspective, it's helpful if we then allow ourselves to put good in perspective. In other words, if we have the right definition of what good is, sometimes we have a hard time letting our anger go because we don't understand what is really good. He says in verse 6, there are many who say, who will show us any good? Many who say, just do what you want. Take vengeance where you want, or ignore your kids' problems, or whatever it is. Do whatever you want, because no one is going to show us any good. But he follows that in verse 6 and says, Lord, lift up the light of your countenance upon us. That's a quote from Numbers chapter 6. And in Numbers chapter 6 and verses 26 and 27, you have what they call the priestly blessing. Numbers chapter 6, you have the priestly blessing. This is what the priest said to the people every day. And they quoted this, and God says, this is how the priest will put my name on them and how I will bless them. Who is it that sees good? It's those who are blessed by God because they have his name on them. That just means they belong to him. Who sees good? Those who belong to God. Verse 7, you have put gladness in my heart more than in the season that their grain and wine increase. That there are those who have done wicked and evil, and they have everything in this life. They have wealth, they have security, their families are healthy, they seem to have no problems. Their grain and wine have increased. And then there's David, and he has nothing. He's climbing a mountain barefoot and weeping with his hood over his head, and he's lost his home, he's lost his throne, he's left some of his family behind. He has nothing. And he says, you have put gladness in my heart. Gladness is brightness. There's a shining, a brightness, a joy. You think of it this way. My nothing is brighter than their everything. Even when physically I have nothing, if I belong to God, I have more than anyone who doesn't belong to God and has all the things that this life offers. And when you know that your nothing is brighter than their everything, you can let go of that anger and just trust God to deal with whatever is going on if someone has hurt you. And that's why he finishes in verse 8 and says, I will both lie down in peace and sleep. Both there is the idea of together. And the idea of I will instantaneously fall asleep. You ever done that? You hit the pillow and you're out just like that, like a light, But David is so unconcerned. He is so at peace. He trusts God so much that he's not going to lay up all night fuming about Absalom or worried about what's going to happen. He lays down and he instantly goes to sleep. He trusts God. He says, you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Don't miss the significance of that word dwell. He has no dwelling place. He left his palace. He left his home. He has nowhere to lay down his head. But if he belongs to God, anywhere that he is, no matter who is against him, no matter who he is angry at, anywhere he is, he dwells in safety because he trusts in God. My spiritual security is unchanged regardless of my circumstances. This is Jesus in Mark chapter 4, when he is sleeping in that boat while the lake is up and down with the storm and the torrent and the waves and the wind and the lightning. And how can you be sleeping? We're going to perish here. And he wakes up and says, why are you afraid? If we belong to God, he is going to take care of us. Sometimes we have great anger because of the storms of life. But if we belong to God, and if we will listen to the counsel of Psalm 4, to handle anger in a godly way, so that we don't let anger control us, we will find anger is something we can let go of. Anger is something that we can give to God and let him work it all out. Anger is something that doesn't have to control us, because even when someone takes everything from you, that'd be a reason to be angry, right? You have everything you need. Even when your security is threatened, that'd be a reason to be angry. You have everything you need if you simply belong to God. This morning we want to help you belong to God if you don't yet. That there is such great peace and joy and the ability to overcome life's challenges if you do belong to God. And there are all the promises that he gives us of eternal life, of a home with him in heaven forever. We want to help you to have that this morning if you don't yet have it. If you are just struggling with anger, if you are struggling with strong emotions, if you are struggling to get a hold of your life, it feels like you're more run by your emotions than you are running your emotions. We want to pray for you and to counsel you and to offer whatever it is that the church can give you. And so we ask that you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.